So welcome everyone to the launch of The Owl House by Daniel Butler, who's there on your screen, the light shining behind him. It's long been a plan of Seren's to increase the amount of nature writing in Wales and to also address that little band of Wales in the middle, which isn't the South Wales industrial valleys and isn't the northern coastal strip or Snowdonia. So when Daniel came to us with the idea for the Owl House, it fitted the bill absolutely perfectly. And I think that I'm so pleased to publish a book on those subjects by a writer as accomplished and as expert as Daniel, that I think we're going to really enjoy this evening. This evening is going to be Daniel in conversation with John Gower, and I'm going to hand over now to John to kick things off. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mick. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce Daniel Butler to those people who don't know him. And we're going to go through the Owl House, I suppose, by starting by looking through the window. Not that you are looking through the window, but from my window, I can look across the garden, and about 10 yards away, I can see my neighbour's kitchen lights, and sometimes I can see my neighbour. Daniel, just give us a sense of where the Owl House is, where you live, and what you can see if you look through the window this evening.
Well, obviously, at the moment, I can't see very much because it's dark. That's actually one of the beauties of it. I mean, it's not quite as crass as it sounds. One of the things that I love about living here on a Welsh mountain, almost exactly on the 1100-foot contour, is that on a night like this, I cannot see any lights at all. It's in perfect, splendid isolation. In theory, if there was light, I could, if I looked across the lane, I would see a barn, which is where the appropriately named barn owl used to live. Unfortunately, she's no longer with us, but I would sit here watching this barn owl flying backwards and forwards every evening, and slowly she became tamer and tamer. And in the end, she would actually come in and take food from my hand. And she reared, the first year she reared 4 young owlets, and last year she raised 5 and fledged them all, which actually is not bad going for a barn owl. They don't live very long, 3, 4, 5 years, and she was about 4 when she unfortunately met a fatal accident. But she really enhanced my life, and I think that that's one of the great things about mid Wales is, as Mick has sort of suggested, it's not really very well known. It's sometimes described as the hole in the donut. I mean, people know about Pembrokeshire and they know about the Brecon Beacons and they know about Snowdonia and possibly Anglesey, but what they don't know about is that bit in the middle, which is a pity because it is actually one of the great kind of wildlife refuges of Britain. I mean, certainly, the Highlands of Scotland are rightly known for their wildlife. The middle of Wales is sadly overlooked, I think, by far too many people. And it's been, I mean, obviously it's famous, iconically famous for the red kites that clung on here when exterminated everywhere else in Britain. And they've mounted a spectacular comeback. They've been helped by reintroductions elsewhere. Although, as I say in the book, I mean, I'm rather anti-introductions, and maybe we could talk about the whole point about letting nature actually do itself, do the work for itself, because I think it's much more successful.
I think we'll talk about various species as we progress through the evening. But seeing as we've started with the barn owl, and that's the species that gives the title to the book, you give us a lot of detail about the barn owl. You go and investigate the pellets, which is a good way of working out what its diet is. You tell us how light the barn owl is. You also tell us how difficult to see the barn owl is, or can be, because for a white bird it can be quite hard to see. But to give us a flavour of the book, I think you've got a little reading of your first encounter with the barn owl.
Well, my first encounter, sorry, you want me to read about when I first met it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It was in late spring that first year that I caught my first really good view of the barn owl. Although I knew that they were present from the occasional glimpse from the car headlights down on the main roads, it was several months before I saw one actually hunting around the farm. I'd gone out hoping to see badger cubs on a glorious May evening, so even though the sun was about to set and it was comparatively late, there was still almost an hour of light left. It was warm and the light was soft and had that wonderful golden glow of low sun casting long shadows across the land. I toiled up the steep slope towards the set, skirting round the side of the conifer plantation before walking west along the contour, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the prevailing breeze in my face, and my camera, complete with telephoto lens, was set for the light and with a quick shutter speed. The long grass was warm as I sank down on the hillside, reveling in spectacular views down the Wye Valley, over the Epent ranges between Bilth and Brecon, towards the distant Pen y Fan. The air was full of the thick, slightly musty scent of pollen. To start with, there was nothing but birdsong. This was already starting to calm down from the frenzy of the month earlier, but a few males were still bothering to proclaim their territories. I sank into the grass, lapping up the smells, sounds, and sights of a heavenly evening. After 20 minutes or so, I was rewarded by movement some 30 yards away. It came from a hillside hole, but it was not badgers, but a cascade of 4 fox cubs. They were playing at the entrance of an earth that had once been a rabbit bury. I raised my camera ever so slowly and clicked away. For 10 minutes, I was entranced as they rolled and tumbled around the dusty earth their mother had presumably scratched out in spring as she enlarged the burrow. Eventually, the cubs noticed my presence and scrambled back underground. I turned to look down the hill, the sunset to my right and the Brecon beacons in front. The hill was bathed in the warm orange light of the now vanished sun, reflecting off the clouds overhead. I felt an inner glow. This is my hillside and these were my views. I lay down, sinking beneath the grass seed heads to bask in the scenery and the calls of songbirds settling down for the night. My nostrils were filled with delicate scents of pollen, and bumblebees buzzed over the grass around me. 2 large black beetles struggled around the tussocks, making heavy weather of the long blades, but obviously intent on some destination, maybe a hole or dung pile. A few gatekeeper butterflies flitted over the grass, and in the distance a tractor was chugging. I lay back on the grass and stared at the heavens. It was one of those days where the sky, while still bright, contained the moon, and Venus was starting to be visible as a faint pinprick just above the western horizon. And then the owl appeared, a large white form floating silently across the hillside on steady wing beats. Well, I say white, which is how a barn owl normally appears when glimpsed at night, and particularly when this is in the beam of a torch or a car headlight, for it's the pure white of the underside and the face which catch the light best. But in the dwindling daylight this evening, I was much more struck by quite how golden its upper feathers appeared. Anyone who's seen a barn owl close up will know that its mantle is a soft yellow, interspersed with greys and light browns and dotted with tiny black spots. It was the golden upper parts that caught the dying light best, and it positively seemed to glow, particularly each time she wheeled around to make another pass above the silvery seed heads which rippled in the lightest of breezes. Anyway, that's how I first saw the owl.
And it's a completely idyllic description. Now, you moved to the house about, well, a quarter of a century ago, really. And one of the things that strikes me about the book is how often your experiences of nature are very, very intimate. The wrens which roost actually in the wall of your home, the weasels that run through the wood pile. You get opportunities that many naturalists don't get, which is to find nature literally living cheek by jowl right next to you.
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I literally have bats in my living room at the moment. And well, they may not be there at the moment. They may have flown out to go hunting, but they roost in the rafters in my living room and fly around to warm up just before dusk. It does mean that there's a bit of bat shit in the living room, but that's a small price to pay for actually sharing your house with. And they're brown, long-eared bats, by the way, if anybody's a bat aficionado. I've got pipistrelles outside.
You found it quite hard to get the local bat expert to come around to help you identify the different bats you had, though.
Well, I mean, she was
a bit laggard.
She's busy. I mean, and she's a great bat aficionado. And it took some badgering. to get her to come. But eventually she did come. She set up her bat detector, left it there for about a week, and then said that there were noctuals in the barn opposite. That's the same barn as the barn owl.
So these
was
are big
roosting in.
bats, big substantial bats.
Yeah, and there are pipistrelles above the back door. And there are brown long-eared bats, as I say, in the living room. And she thought that there were probably 2 or 3 other species there, but she's never got back to me, having analysed the whole sort of trace on her computer. I mean, it's busy. I mean, I love bats, but at the same time, one bat is quite like another. You know, when you just see them sort of flittering around the place. But no, it is lovely. I mean, living cheek by jowl with nature. One thing which I think is quite interesting about, I mean, in the 25 years that I've lived here, wildlife has seemed to get much tamer. I mean, certainly when I first moved here, red kites, you couldn't get within 200 or 300 yards of them. The second that they saw a human wandering around in the field, they'd take to the air and disappear. At the moment, the kites, I mean, I don't know, they roosted in, I mean, they nested in my back garden last year. And there's another nest just up the hill near the badger set that I mentioned in that reading. And there's constantly 3 or 4 or 5 floating overhead. They've got so much quieter, and no, they're not quieter, actually, no, they've got noisier, I shouldn't say. But there are so many of them. Certainly when I first came here, there were 2 pairs, I think, nesting in the Ellen Valley, and now they're all over the place. And indeed, the Welsh kites are recolonizing Britain from here. I think I mentioned in the book that there was this very high-profile reintroduction scheme where they took kites from Spain and Scandinavia and released them in first Oxfordshire and then Yorkshire and then half a dozen other places around Britain. And I mentioned that I was talking to Iolo Williams when I first got here. He was still working for the RSPB then. And he was really quite cross about the reintroduction scheme, even though it was the RSPB that was doing it, his employer. But he was saying, Welsh kites are doing really well. They can reconquer England on their own. They don't need help. And if only I'd got the resources which have been put into releasing kites in England, I could have probably saved the black grouse in Wales. I mean, actually, I think the black grouse is still just about here, but there are very, very few of them.
I have seen a red kite flying over the keep in the middle of Windsor Castle. So they've really gone to the heart of Merry England. You were the beneficiary of being taken around by Iolo Williams to see various things, but you also had a chance to encounter just how fast and dangerously he drives.
Oh God, yes.
Oh God, yes. I lived with him for 5 years. I survived those 5 years.
Well, I certainly, I think my hair sort of started to turn white when he drove me once up to the Berwyn Mountains to look at some persecution of peregrines and hen harriers up there. Now, that's about sort of 2 hours north of here. And then, of course, there's the 2-hour return journey. And I swear that my fingerprints were indelibly stuck into the passenger seat of his car. It was terrifying.
I have to tell you that the only time they ever found a nightjar, which is a fairly rare bird in Wales still, on the RSPB reserve at Lake Vyrnwy, was the one we picked out of Iolo Williams's radiator grill. He mowed it down. There is one thing you do share with Iolo, not beyond your passion and interest in nature, but it's a very specific interest in raptors, in birds of prey.
Yes.
Because when you first moved to Wales, it was the birds of prey more than anything pretty much that drew you here.
Yeah, I got hooked on birds of prey when I was 10 and I found a kestrel with a sprained wing. And I kind of looked after it for 3 weeks and started training it as a sort of falconry bird. And then, being only a 10-year-old, I managed to make a silly mistake and I lost it, and it flew off. But it started a sort of lifelong obsession with sort of falconry and birds of prey. I should say that I'm not particularly into the sort of blood sport side of falconry. It's just, as you know, as everybody knows, birds of prey tend to be really quite secretive and elusive. And also, many of them, such as peregrines and goshawks, are extremely quick and your chances of actually seeing one sort of hunting are really quite low. I mean, obviously here I regularly see sparrowhawks and peregrines and occasional goshawks flying and hunting, but you don't actually see them really chasing anything. You just see them sort of inquisitively kind of looking for stuff. The great thing about training a hawk yourself is that you actually get to see it really close up, doing what it does best. And hawks, and I use hawks in the loosest sense of the word, raptors, you know, the thing which they do best is hunt. That's what they're designed for, and that's what they do extremely well.
Some people have Sky at home, by which we mean Rupert Murdoch's TV channel. But in your case, you had Sky at home, but it was a completely different animal.
Yes, she's still out there. Sky is now she's a 4-year-old female goshawk, very big, quite aggressive, particularly towards small furry things, but also towards me. Training her, I've got my hands are sort of perpetually scarred with her lashing out with her feet, but no, she's an obsession, and I've also got another female goshawk called Keris.
You acquired Sky because your grandmother left you a bit of money, I think, and you
yes,
buy a goshawk.
That's right. Yeah, no, yes, my godmother left me, I think it was £1,000, and that's roughly speaking the cost of a goshawk, which is not as expensive as it sounds, given that a goshawk lives for up to 25, 30 years, and that's basically on the par with a pedigree dog, I would say.
So for those people who don't know what a goshawk is, if I was to suggest, it's a bit like a sparrowhawk on steroids, would I be close?
Yeah. Yes, it's. I suppose you could say it's a buzzard-sized sparrowhawk. It weighs actually quite a lot more. A buzzard weighs about 1.5 pounds, and my female goshawks weigh about 3 pounds. That's because they're all muscle. So even though they look about the same size as a buzzard, they've got a lot more sort of strength in them.
And this is a bird that's big enough to go after crows and squirrels, and in Wales it's found a superb habitat in fairly thick coniferous woodland.
Well, that's true. Yes. No. I mean, the name goshawk comes from the Anglo-Saxon for goose hawk. I mean, a goshawk will take anything up to the size of a Canada goose or a brown hare. The males are smaller than the females. Males probably specialize mainly in pigeons. But the thing about both, I mean, the goshawks have done incredibly well in Wales. This is yet another thing that we should be celebrating about our wildlife in mid-Wales, is that goshawks were actually deliberately released, and some might be escaped falconry birds, but they were deliberately released near sort of Carmarthen by one particular person.
I remember it well, because I remember they first nested in Pembrey Forest, which is about 5 miles away from my home, and I spent many a summer's day trying to find them, but they proved to be quite elusive. But yet you've actually spent time with Yola Williams, who is a goshawk expert, and he actually told you how you can pretty much locate a goshawk in.
Yeah, no, Yola is
Bruce.
Yeah, no, Yola is a wonderful sort of source of fieldcraft and knowledge. If you go into a conifer plantation and you find a kind of big crossroads, you know, where the rides cross each other, and you want larch trees there, and the goshawk nest will be about 3 or 4 rows in from the crossroads. They like the crossroads because the females, as I say, are big, and so they like a little bit of room to maneuver. Although if you've ever looked on, you mentioned David Attenborough, natural history films. If you just Google goshawk forests or goshawk hunting in forest, you can see this amazing agility. Yeah, but they like larches because that gives them a chance to get in and out easily in the early part of the breeding season, and then they've got the cover of the larch needles coming out and giving them cover, basically, so they get their privacy.
There is a time in the year when they do display, and that's one of the rare occasions when you might be lucky enough to see a goshawk. But in your book, of course, you describe the sheer exhilarating pleasure of taking Sky out and letting it fly. And that
Yeah,
is
I did actually. I mean, Sky, there was one particular occasion which I took her out, and I mean, there aren't very many rabbits or things. I mean, she kills quite a lot of squirrels, but there aren't very many rabbits or things around here. So I took her up the hill. Fantastic views from the top of the hill. You can see, on a good day, you can see every mountain range in Wales from up there, apart from the Preseli Hills, because the Cambrians get in the way. And I took her out and she started flying out. It was a warm day and there was a sort of breeze coming from the south, which meant that there's a natural updraft on the hillside. And she just flew out and she got caught to the updraft and just went up and up and up and soaring out over the valley. And at first I was thinking, God, that's beautiful. And then I started thinking, she's quite a way away. She's going further. But luckily, she changed her mind and sort of returned. And just 2 days ago, I did the same thing with Keris, again at the top of the hill. And she was just flying around almost like a falcon. You know, you've been to falconry sort of displays and things. And, you know, you see the lanner falcons or peregrines or whatever sort of dive bombing the lure, which is being swung by a falconer. This goshawk was basically behaving in the same way, very, very peregrine-like. In fact, actually, goshawks and peregrine, you can get goshawks and peregrines mixed up, even if you know what you're looking for. The goshawk is a sort of rather falcon-like hawk. But no, going back to the thing, I mean, yes, goshawks were released in mid Wales and they've done fantastically well, because basically they live on grey squirrels and pigeons and crows. And basically nobody is very keen on any of those three things. So the goshawks have done spectacularly well all the way along the Cambrian mountains, the sort of ridge of mountains. I believe that there are probably something like 300 pairs of goshawks in Wales, and the entire British population is probably less than 500. So, you know, this really is the stronghold.
The book is about raptors, and of course it's about owls, but it's about a lot more. It's about settling into a place. You know, it takes a quarter of a century for you to, you know, get to know the place and to be accepted and so on. One of the things that struck me about the way the book is patterned is that there is a seasonality to it. Not that you do, you know, here's the arrival of spring and here's the, you know, beginning of summer. But in mid Wales, where you live, one of the most notable and delightful arrivals are the songbirds that arrive from Africa. And you're living in a place with the oak woodlands where pied flycatchers turn up, very dapper birds, almost in a tuxedo of black and white in the case of the male birds, and the redstarts, very shy birds. And they seem to be, you know, very much the birds of Rhayader and of mid Wales.
Well, again, I'm going back to Iolo. I mean, everybody sort of thinks of the red kite as being the iconic bird of mid Wales. But Iolo once said to me, you know, actually, if you're a serious birder, you don't really care that much about red kites because they're sort of two a penny, particularly now when they're found all over England as well. They said, but the redstart and the pied flycatcher, those are the two, those are what you should really regard as the iconic birds of mid Wales. They're the ones where, you know, I mean, you do get redstarts on the west coast of Scotland, but not very many. This, again, Wales, this is one of the things that we should be sort of celebrating as a sort of natural wonder that we've got here. We've also, of course, got things like polecats. Those were also exterminated pretty much everywhere else in Britain by Victorian gamekeepers. And they have mounted a spectacular recovery from their heartland, which is here in mid Wales. And they're now found all the way over as far as East Anglia, having made their own way there.
You devote quite a lot of time to the muscelids, the stoats, the weasels, but the biggest member of the family gets special attention because it's not only very numerous on the Wye, but also a genuine conservation success story, and that is the otter.
Yeah, my mother, who was Welsh, she always used to say that a tragedy of Welsh history is that so many of the rivers flow east-west. And what this meant was the Normans were quite able to sort of march straight into the middle of Wales and basically take it over in the 13th century, or 12th and 13th century. But conversely, this has been very good for wildlife's recovery, in the sense that it's very easy for otters, for example. I mean, most of Britain's otters, I mean, the heaviest concentration of otters in Britain is up in the west coast of Scotland. But the problem is that because of the central belt there, they can't colonize England. They can't really sort of move south very easily. Similarly, the West Country's got some otters, but again, you've got some geographical problems with the otters making their way east. Whereas the Welsh otters, and as you say, particularly on the Wye, and to the same, so a slightly lesser extent on the Severn, have found it very easy to sort of to move into the Midlands and then beyond. And I think that's one of the other themes of the book is basically the otters had had a really bad time, and by the middle of the 1970s, they were struggling on the brink of extinction. And the real change came when the Clean Water Directive was passed, and the water companies started to clean up the polluted rivers and canals of the Midlands. And that allowed the otter to mount a spectacular sort of recovery, moving, as I say, east. I mean, I'm originally, as you might be able to tell from my accent, from Oxford. And otters, Welsh otters, and I think they've even managed to work out that there was an otter from the Wye, have managed to make their way up over the Cotswold escarpment and into the Thames. And now they've even been spotted, I think, down in London now. And those will be Welsh in origin.
One of the things that you have in the book as well, obviously we've been talking about woodland birds, but there's a real relationship between yourself and not just woodlands, but wood. In fact, the beams behind you and so on. You've explored the history of the barn, you've explored the history of the house, and also you've had to get to understand wood, not only as a building material, but as a source of fuel. There's an intimacy to the knowledge you have about trees and wood for different purposes.
Well, when you live in a house, and this house, I don't know exactly how old this house is, but I think it's probably about 17th century, late 17th century. And when we moved into it, there was no central heating here at all. And I had started having to sort of light fires in order to stay warm with my then pregnant partner, who has an intolerance of cold.
And batshit, presumably.
Well, she's not so bothered about the batshit. I mean, I think, you know, it's just a joy to share a house with wildlife like that. No, but you do get it. You do become increasingly obsessed with wood. I mean, I'm feeling slightly embarrassed here because Vic Pardo is watching what's going on here, and he's a man who really knows about wood, whereas I'm just muck around with a chainsaw and chop up logs and split them and get increasingly obsessed. It's always the same at this time of year. Every year, I think I've got enough firewood, and I suddenly start looking at the dwindling pile and thinking, "Oh God, am I actually going to make it to the new year?" But yes, you do get very obsessed. I also get, I mean, it's not just the wood that you're burning, it's also, we restored the barn next door, the one where the bats are living, the living room sort of bit. We restored it with green oak framing, which is how it was originally constructed. And green oak framing is peculiarly, I mean, it's really clever. It's very ancient building technique. It's really clever. And we used exactly the same techniques to restore the barn as it were used in its original construction. Yes, so wood is very important to me. I mean, also I planted I felled a conifer plantation behind the house and replanted it with 1,300 native hardwood trees. And that has been incredibly rewarding in terms of quite how quickly they've managed to regenerate. And this bit of Welsh hillside, which at one point looked like the Somme, it was just a muddy morass of brash and bare earth. And yet, sort of 15 years later, the trees there are sort of 20, 30, even 40 foot high. It's you know, basically, okay, I did plant them, but there's another plantation just at the bottom of my valley where a guy moved in and he refused to replant it. the planning authorities came in and tried to evict him. And then they said that he had to replant it, because when you get a felling license, you're obliged to restock the land. And he refused to replant it. He said, no, he'd let nature do the work for him. And here we are 25, 30 years later. And it's amazing that, I mean, that's even bigger. The trees there are even bigger than the ones in mine. And what happens is it's nature does take over. There was, I mean, some of the thing is you get birch, you know, which blows in on its sort of downy seeds. They get blown in. And then you get quite a lot of pigeons roosting in amongst the trees. And they, of course, in their droppings, bring in rowan berries and other stuff. And then the wonderful bird, the jay, comes in, and, you know, each jay buries up to 3,000 acorns a month during the autumn. It hides each one of them individually in the soil, not like a squirrel where you have a kind of cache of nuts. They hide them all individually, and they plant them actually in the ground. And amazingly, they're able to find almost all of them in studies by scientists. But obviously, they don't always get every one of them. So down at, as I say, the oaks have actually also colonized this bit of former woodland at the bottom of the valley. And I think that this is what I'm saying about like cleaning up the waterways for the otters. Nature is incredibly regenerative. I mean, I am an environmentalist, of course, and, you know, and I worry about the world getting hotter and hotter and the awful things that we're doing to the environment. And yet it's not all doom and gloom. You know, nature can recover if it's just given a chance, basically.
When you planted this stretch of woodland, in a sense, you were turning the clock back in terms of the history of Wales, because at one point, 90% of the landmass of Wales was covered in this enormous wildwood. So in essence, it's giving you a sense of how the old ecology of Wales worked, where we actually had, you know, cover for all sorts of different kinds of animals. And one of the animals that you touch upon in the book is the wild boar, of course, because wild boars love that sort of new forestation.
Yes. No, I mean, wild boar are exciting as far as I'm concerned. Unfortunately, we don't yet have them here. It won't be very long. They're on the way,
though.
They are on the way.
They're on their way this evening.
There are a lot of them in the Forest of Dean, and apparently they've been seen on the north side of the Wye down there near Monmouth. So it's not going to be long before they get here. And also, I mean, another thing that's happened during the 25 years that I've been here is roe deer and muntjac are coming in quite large quantities. I mean, I now regularly see them. I saw my first roe deer here only about 5 years ago, and now I see them really quite regularly. I mean, obviously foresters aren't quite so keen on the roe deer, and even less keen on the muntjac.
Because they strip the bark away, don't they? From
yes, yes, they do, and they prevent natural regeneration. But boar are actually quite good because they act as a sort of a wild, I mean, a living snowplow, if you like. I mean, they just churn up the ground, which creates a natural seedbed for, as I say, forest regeneration.
So let's say you ended up with a wild boar that may have been, you know, knocked over or whatever someday. You would be the man best placed, probably in mid Wales, to know what sort of mushrooms you could add to make the perfect wild boar recipe. I think
wild boar would go very well with any mushroom, but I think particularly porcini, because porcini, after all, means little piglet. Which no, I mean, yeah, I mean. And that's yet another natural resource that we've got here in huge abundance. Wales has got the perfect climate for fungi. You know, it's mild and it's damp, and it's much better climate for mushrooms than actually most of, you know, France and Italy, the places that we actually associate with them.
And it's something that you've diversified into yourself. I mean, you've been
I have diversified into. Yeah, I do that. I spend two months of every autumn taking people out looking for edible fungi, of which there are a lot around here. I think I had 100 kilos of porcini this year, and then got bored of picking them. But they're all sitting dried on top of my in my larder.
Do people who visit the house get bored with being offered mushroom soup then?
No, it's more me getting bored of eating mushrooms. So I don't force them down friends. You know, if somebody comes to stay for a weekend, I feel obliged to give them at least one mushroom meal. But I don't make them eat them 24/7.
But I was saying earlier about your intimate understanding of nature, and in the little film that Sarah made of you going about the business of harvesting mushrooms, you're there with a basket. It's actually a very delicate art. You have to understand the woodland floor. You have to know where these things, the seps and all the rest of them, grow, and also there's a delicacy to picking them.
Well, that's true. The biggest problem is actually doing the research, because if you go into any of the really big woods around here, you can wander around for an awfully long time and not find anything at all. And then suddenly you hit the sweet spot. And obviously the sweet spot remains the same year after year after year. So once you've actually built up sort of local knowledge, which takes quite a lot of hours, then it's much easier to sort of make yourself look incredibly impressive just by wandering into a wood where the person you're taking can't find anything at all, and just taking them straight to the spot where there's something growing. But I think that there's also, I mean, one of the other things which is for me developed, I mean, when I first came here, it was because I was drawn by particularly the birds of prey, but the wildlife and the wildness of it all. But after a while, I started getting more interested in the history and starting to sort of read the landscape. And there was one particularly interesting day that I went out with the year before last with Vic, who's actually one of the people watching this thing, and he's just walked out of the room. And they took me up the Ellen Valley to look at the mines up there. And it's funny, I mean, for years would be driving around Mid Wales, not really noticing. But once you start, your attention is drawn to it. You see the sort of spoil, the piles of stone on the hillside. And they are the spoil heaps from when the early miners here were digging their first, they're small tunnels. The mining in Mid Wales is very different from the sort of mining in South Wales. It was for these very rich, small little pockets of expensive minerals like copper and tin. But the mining was on a very small scale. You'd have 2 or 3 guys working in digging a little shaft into the hillside. And after they'd gone 50 yards or something, they'd basically either give up or they'd hit the big time. And unlike South Wales, where all the the old former coal mines have all been landscaped and planted with birch and trees and things like that, and you wouldn't really notice that there'd ever been mines there. But round here, because these mines, most of them were abandoned 2, 3, 4 centuries ago, the spoil heaps are just still there on the landscape. And similarly, if you go into the hills and you look around, you can see, if you know roughly speaking, what you're looking for. It's not a terribly difficult art, but you can see the remains of the old drovers' roads. I mean, for example, houses where they would give the drovers, rest and food for the night. They'd plant 2 or 3 Scots pines next to the house, which was a kind of visual mark on the landscape that the drovers, as they were trudging across from Ceredigion towards the Midlands, they could see where they could find a bite to eat and somewhere to put to rest for the night.
We've touched upon woodland and woodland birds and raptors and the muscelids. There's one thing that we haven't actually talked about in any detail, and that's water. Because if you live in the part of Wales where you live, be it the corralled waters of the Elan Valley or the Wye itself, water and rivers are very important. And then, of course, fishing is important. And I've heard rumours that people in the Ryder area have occasionally turned to poaching. I'll whisper the word.
Yeah, it was funny. I mean, yeah, again, that's the wonderful bit of the local history. The Wye used to be the premier salmon river in Britain. Sadly, it is no longer what it was. But in the salmon there was a great source of food for the poor and the locals in mid Wales, until the Victorians started to get a passion for fly fishing. And then they kind of basically bought up all the fishing rights and sealed the source of fish off from the locals. Now there's people here, I mean, most people here will have heard of the Rebecca riots, which were in the late 1830s and early 1840s, which started off by people complaining about the toll bridges and about the cost of moving from one place to another, particularly when they were driving cattle or something like that. And obviously the roads were gated off and you had to pay to get the gate opened. So this is how the Rebecca riots sort of started off, as a sort of, working class protest against, particularly the English tended to be the people who owned the toll houses. But then slowly that fizzled out in the middle of the 1840s, when the government came in and decided that it was about time that the tolls were taken down and that the roads should be kind of free to walk along. By this stage, the rioters used to disguise themselves by dressing up in women's clothes and blacking their faces. And once they'd finished rebelling against the tolls, they switched to salmon poaching, and it became a local sort of tradition that when you went salmon poaching, you'd put on ladies' clothes and black your face and go down with gaffs, these kind of hooked harpoons, and catch the fish. And it would be at this time of year when they're bedding down in the river, in the gravel beds, in the Ellen and in the Wye, and in the tributaries of the Wye.
I'm trying to remember now whether it's in your book or something else I've read recently that there was something about a train slowing down to help the distribution of poached salmon.
Well, I have heard that as well. There is a nature reserve just north of Rhayader called the Gilfach, and the Gilfach has a river running through it, which is known as the Frood, which I think means the sort of rushing torrent or something. I mean, you're probably Welsh speaker and you can correct me on that. But anyway, this little river, the Frood, has a spectacular series of waterfalls on it. And in the old days, before Mr. Beeching got his hands on the local railways, there was a little railway line that ran up from Rhayader to Newtown. And as it went through the Gilfach, it was going uphill, so it had to slow right down. And there is a story that apparently the guard had a deal with the local poachers. So as the train was going along at sort of 5 miles an hour, the poachers would run alongside the carriages and hand these poached salmon to the railway guard, who'd take them up to Newtown and sell them up there to fishmongers, I suppose. Again, lovely sort of sense of history, throughout the landscape. It's all there if you kind of look for it. I mean, one of the things that I like most in terms of going back to the history thing is, as I say, I've been here for 27 years. And for about the first 20 years, I used to look out to the west of here, and I could just about make out some little kind of lumps on top of the hill behind Llanyssil. And it wasn't until about 5 years ago that I actually eventually walked up there and discovered these collections of rocks. And I thought, this is rather odd. They were obviously man-made, but I couldn't work out why they were there. I thought maybe they were grouse butts or maybe they were sheep pens, but they were in the wrong place. It didn't make sense. And I came back, so I came back down wondering what these were. And I wandered into Rhayader 2 or 3 days later and bumped into a local historian who said, "Oh, they're Neolithic burial cairns, and there are apparently I think there are 13 of them. They're 4,500 years old, I believe. Vic can correct me if I've got this wrong. And it's supposed to be one of the highest, if not the highest concentrations of Neolithic burial cairns in Europe. And there it is, just in the middle of Wales. And nobody's heard of it."
You can add to that finds of Roman gold and so on. I'm just aware of the time, Daniel. So in order to provoke people into sending any questions they want to by way of the chat facility, it's my interviewer's right to ask for my favourite part of your book. And I've therefore put in a request for a little reading about missel thrushes, because I think it's the loveliest passage in the book.
Well, that's very kind of you. Now, I did actually mark this, because you said that you might want to, and I think I found it now. Yeah. Sorry, I'm not trying to. Yes, it's right. Winter bird activity is not just about survival. I used to think that the breeding season was a spring phenomenon, but for many creatures, the concept seems to lurk as a constant background urge. Even in the depths of winter, there are signs of what's to come. Missel thrushes start to gang up towards the end of August in family groups, which later join together to form small flocks. They give off their instantly recognizable football rattle calls as they bounce through the air above the fields. But by the end of the year, these groups have disbanded. Instead of looking for the security of a flock to evade predators, the males are beginning to get a head start on next year's breeding season. They do this by searching for a berry-laden food source. Indeed, the bird's name comes from its fondness for mistletoe, that strange shrub, a living green sphere that hangs in bunches from apparently lifeless limbs of oaks and apple trees. A glance at its fleshy white berries and strange green leaves, and it isn't difficult to see why the Druids apparently venerated it as a sign of life in the depths of winter. The oak or crabapple host would be no more than a black skeleton, yet its passenger would appear the embodiment of life. Mistletoe is rare in Radnorshire, although it's common enough a few miles away in the acres of Herefordshire cider orchards. My missel thrushes are drawn mainly by the lure of another tree beloved by pagans, and one which is, if anything, even more associated with Christmas. There is a particularly splendid and always well-endowed holly halfway down the lane. The berries grow slowly all autumn, green and hard and invisible among the glossy spiked leaves, until they burst into view by turning red seemingly overnight. By the time I go to collect a few decorative sprigs in early December, there will already be a resident missel thrush. His favourite perch is near the crown to gain a good vantage point. He sits here like a miser crouched over his hoard, jealously watching for thieves or rivals which may try to steal his crown. At my approach, he flies off, giving his raucous rattling calls of alarm towards the the row of neighbouring pines. He perches there, and with binoculars I can just make him out, staring warily at me, filled with terrors that his jewelled kingdom might be raided in his absence.
Thank you, Daniel. One thing that I was struck by, I keep on thinking, I've lived in Wales long enough to know about, quite a few things, and then there's always that new discovery. And the thing I'd like you to share is something that excited me very much in your book, which is a connection between exactly where you live and one of my all-time heroes, one of the people who really did fire up my enthusiasm for birds, being the bird photographer Eric Hosking.
Oh, yes. Yes, that was, I don't know if any of you can remember Animal Magic, but Eric Hosking used to occasionally appear on that, and he was a brilliant wildlife photographer. And he was photographed, but he was also very piratical when he appeared there with Johnny Morris, because he had lost an eye. So he had an eye patch on one eye and would kind of glare around. It was obviously his other eye, very sharp as a great photographer. And he took, there's a particularly iconic photograph of a barn owl that he took, which is one you will have all seen it. It looks like an angel. Its wings are exactly the right position up above its head, and it's coming in through a church or a barn window, and it looks, as I say, like an angel. Anyway, he was photographing tawny owls down at Doldowlod, which is just at the bottom of my little valley here, and he conducted. I mean, obviously, this was in the days of very clumsy kind of magnesium flashes, and film speeds were not very quick and all this sort of thing. So he built a great big scaffolding tower next to a tawny owl nest, and went up there and would obviously spend, kind of evenings trying to photograph them. And he went up there to, having sort of set this thing up, and went up to see if he could get any photographs, but the birds weren't playing. So he went down and started to go back to his car, and then he bumped into two sort of people who he thought looked very suspicious. And as he'd left, several £100 worth of cameras up the scaffolding tower, he decided to go back and retrieve his cameras. And suddenly, the next thing he knew, there was an alrighty bang, and a tawny owl had spiked him in the eye. And basically, that was how he lost his eyesight. Anyway, I didn't know about this until very recently. And when I just sort of discovered what a beautiful, well, it's not a beautiful thing, it was very unfortunate for Eric Hoskin, but it's the symmetry of having owls in the barn opposite my study window, and this famous incident happening in, I think it was 1938.
And of course, it gave the title to Eric Hoskin's memoir, which was called An Eye for a Bird.
Yes, yes, it
that
did.
moment was the moment that was, pivotal in giving him the title of the book. You've written this book now, and it's a sort of appraisal of you settling in, as I suggested, of you getting to know the place. Is it also like a sort of thank you letter for what this area, what this house, what living there has given you as a person?
Yes, I suppose it is. I mean, I have loved living here. I mean, it is a magical place. You fall more and more in love with it whilst you're here. As I say, it's a learning process because there's always something new. There's a part of the landscape, or there's a new wildlife sighting to get excited about and to get interested in. I mean, you've mentioned the fact that I've got weasels and stoats running around my wood piles, which I love. I've got a thing about, as well as raptors, I've got a thing about mustelids, the whole members of the weasel family. But also, I mean, as I say, in spring, who could not be excited when you wake up on mid-April, and it almost happens overnight. One moment, everything looks a little bit sort of drab and grey and a bit pathetic, and then suddenly the next morning, the hedges and the woods are just ringing with birdsong. All the migrants have just come in almost overnight, and they managed to time their arrival almost simultaneously. They're all suddenly here. And then there's that glorious sort of 2 weeks when you can actually see them, and then the leaves grow and you can't anymore. But I must say that because I'm rather unmusical, I still struggle with warblers. There are 15 species of warbler or thereabouts in Britain, and the only way you can really tell them apart is by their song. And I just can't remember the song properly. I mean,
other than the really easy one, the chiff chaff, because I've just
even I actually, that would be really sad if I couldn't recognise the chiff chaff.
We have a question, and you have to forgive me for the pronunciation, from Diana Mehew, if that's the correct pronunciation. And this is a sort of trades description sort of question, because her question is your book, Daniel, as wide-ranging as this conversation has been?
I hope so. I hope so.
It is. We've only been talking about things in the book, Diana.
Yes, we have only been talking about it. I mean, I started off trying to write a book really just about barn owls, but then that would be a very short book because you'd run out of things to say after a while. So I then started ranging into other things, and then suddenly it sort of became a sort of stream of consciousness about the interesting things, the fascinating things that I've managed to garner from the Radnorshire landscape. It's not all about Radnorshire. It's also, I mean, there are other things in there which are Ceredigion. It is gorgeous, a gorgeous resource only just over the mountains. But it is a tribute to a place that has given me so much over the last 25 years.
Well, it remains to me to thank you very much indeed, Daniel, and to encourage you all not only to buy a copy for yourselves, but also bearing in mind that Christmas is almost upon us. It would make a fantastic stocking filler, not just for people in Radnorshire and not just for people in adjoining counties like Ceredigion, but for anyone who is interested in Wales and wildlife and the relationship between us and that wildlife, because it's very important. It can be as intimate as having the wrens roosting in the wall of the house, but also our very futures depend on it. So thank you, Daniel, for sharing an account of 25 years of getting to know a place and getting to know it so well that it does become a part of you.
Diolch yn fawr.
Croeso. And thanks to all of you for joining in this evening. Enjoy the rest of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, John, as well, for hosting the conversation with Daniel. Mick, is there anything you'd like to say?
Well, I think actually what I was going to say, John's kind of beaten me to it. It is Christmas coming up, and we should all bear that in mind. It's been a fantastic evening, I think, and the book, well, the evening and also the book gives us a lot to think about. So many stories in it. And thank goodness that Daniel has two sharp eyes and not just one. It's a great celebration of Mid Wales. We're calling it Mid Wales Pastoral because it belongs in that set of books that have been written by people like Roger Deakin and Robert Macfarlane and Lewis Stemple. And it also puts Mid Wales into the landscapes that those writers have written. And we're very grateful to Daniel for having written the book and sharing it with us. So thank you all very much for coming. The book is on sale at all good bookshops, and we wish you well in the coming dark months.